Between 2015 and 2017, one company went on the wildest shopping spree in corporate history. A quarter of Hilton hotels, the largest stake in Deutsche Bank, Germany's biggest lender. A Park Avenue skyscraper, golf courses near Seattle, the third largest aircraft leasing company on Earth. More than $50 billion of deals in barely 3 years, and Wall Street could not work out who the buyers really were. This was not a sovereign wealth fund, and not a tech giant. It was an airline. Hainan Airlines, from a tropical island most Americans cannot find on a map, started with so little money that its founder joked he could not afford a wing. Within a few years of the spree, one chairman was dead at the bottom of a cliff in France. The founder was heading for a prison cell, and the empire collapsed in the biggest bankruptcy China has ever seen. And through every single day of it, the planes never stopped flying. Anyone can tell you how this empire died. The interesting question is why? Why banks kept lending billions to owners nobody could name? Why the man who ran the machine ended up dead on the rocks in Provence? And why the airline at the bottom of the wreckage refused to die? This is that story. Every collapse has a blueprint, and this one was drawn in 1989 on Hainan, a tropical island off China's southern coast that Beijing had just declared a special economic zone with beaches, ambition, and almost no good way to reach it. The provincial government wanted an airline, and the man handed the job was Chen Feng, a 36-year-old former aviation official trained at a Lufthansa college in Germany. Beside him stood Wang Jian, a quiet operator from China's Civil Aviation Administration. Chen would become the face. Wang would run the machine. 3 decades later, one would be dead below a stone wall in France, and the other would trade a headquarters, shaped like a sitting Buddha, for a prison cell. Their starting capital was 10 million yuan, about $1.5 million, when a single Boeing 737 cost 30 times that amount. Chen spent years joking that it was not even enough to buy a wing. Hold on to that joke, because this story ends with creditors claiming $187 billion. The first gear appeared in January 1993. Chen restructured the company into China's first joint stock airline. For the first time, private investors, and even the airline's own staff, could buy shares in a Chinese carrier. Watch the mechanics, because this exact play, scaled up 1,000 times, eventually kills the company. Step 1, sell shares and raise 250 million yuan. Step 2, take the airline's most precious piece of paper, its operating license, and use it to unlock hundreds of millions more in bank loans. Step 3, turn the borrowed money into 2 Boeing 737s, leased from an Australian lessor. Paper became trust, trust became credit, credit became airplanes. On May 2nd, 1993, the first flight lifted off from Haikou for Beijing. And if you flew Hainan back then, the man pouring your tea was sometimes Chen Feng himself, serving passengers while the cameras clicked. In 1995, Chen ran the same play on a bigger stage. He flew to New York and talked his way in front of George Soros, and he walked out with $25 million for a stake of just under 15%. The first major foreign investment ever made in a Chinese airline. A carrier that could not afford a wing now had one of the most famous investors on the planet on its shareholder list, and every famous name made the next loan easier. The airline turned a profit in its very first year and kept earning for a decade straight. And here's the part people forget. Underneath the financial engineering, this was genuinely a good airline. While China's state giants treated passengers like cargo, Hainan drilled its cabin crews to a standard the big three never matched and built a reputation as the finest service in Chinese aviation. That was the market power play. Never fight the state where it is strong. Fight where it is lazy, and win on service. Hainan grew into the 4th largest airline in the country, the biggest not owned by the state, and in 1998 became the first Chinese carrier to own a piece of an airport, buying a quarter of its home base at Haikou Meilan. Then, in the year 2000, came the moment it should have died. Beijing merged the country's small airlines into 3 state giants, and Hainan was supposed to be swallowed. Instead, it went on offense, buying 3 smaller airlines in under 2 years and creating a parent company to hold them all. That parent was called HNA Group. Remember the name, because from this point on, the airline and the empire are 2 different characters in the same story. One makes money by flying passengers, the other makes money by borrowing it. The second character took control in 2003. The SARS epidemic emptied China's skies, and Hainan lost 1.47 billion yuan, 5 times more than other airlines. Chen drew a conclusion that would eventually destroy everything he had built. Relying on an airline alone, he said, was not wise. HNA had to own other things: hotels, airports, logistics, finance, anything. Diversification began as a survival instinct. It ended as an addiction. For a while, it looked like genius because the airline underneath kept climbing. In 2005, orders went out for the Boeing 787 Dreamliner before the type had even flown. In 2008, Hainan opened its first route to North America with the same power play it had used at home. Skip the crowded trunk routes, fly non-stop to the cities the state carriers ignored, and win on service. Soon, its Dreamliners were flying the first non-stop ever between China and Boston. By the mid-2010s, the group held stakes in more than a dozen airlines, including 2 carriers in Hong Kong, and its family of airlines operated more than 600 aircraft. Every one of those routes was real. The problem was what was growing above them. Chinese credit was cheap, banks were showering money on politically connected champions, and HNA perfected a machine that sounded like financial alchemy. Buy an asset with borrowed money. Pledge that asset as collateral. Borrow more. Buy the next one. It was the 1993 license trick, scaled from millions into billions. And from a headquarters in Haikou, shaped like a giant sitting Buddha, Chen Feng, a devout Buddhist who dressed like a monk and preached compassion in interviews, unleashed one of the most aggressive acquisition campaigns the world has ever seen. The shopping list still reads like satire. $6.5 billion for a quarter of Hilton. Around $3.7 billion for nearly 10% of Deutsche Bank, making an airline group from a Chinese island the biggest shareholder of Germany's biggest bank. $6 billion in cash for Ingram Micro, the world's largest technology distributor and the biggest American tech company ever swallowed by a Chinese buyer. $10 billion for the aircraft leasing arm of CIT, which turned HNA's Avalon into the 3rd largest jet lessor on the planet. The Radisson hotel chain, Swissport, the ground handler loading bags across the globe, Gate Group, the caterer cooking your airline meals, a skyscraper at 245 Park Avenue in New York for $2.21 billion above market price, 8 golf courses in Washington state for $137 million. Chen and his brother each picked up $47 million apartments in Manhattan. In 2015, HNA entered the Fortune Global 500 at number 464. 2 years later, it stood at number 170 with $53 billion in revenue. And HNA was not even alone. Anbang, an insurer, had bought the Waldorf Astoria, and Wanda was buying Hollywood. An entire generation of Chinese conglomerates was purchasing the world on credit. But nobody bought like HNA. By the end of 2017, the group was sitting on roughly $240 billion in assets. But underneath the trophies, 2 questions were eating the empire alive, and they explain why it all came down. The first question: who actually owned HNA? Nobody could answer it. Journalists and regulators discovered that one of the largest shareholders was Guanjun, an obscure man with no business track record, sitting on a stake worth billions. When the questions grew too loud, his shares were abruptly donated to a charity in New York, and HNA declared that Buddhist-style foundations now controlled the majority of one of China's largest companies. Swiss regulators later ruled that HNA had given false information about its own shareholders during a takeover. Banks were lending tens of billions to a company that could not clearly explain who it belonged to, and for years the loans kept coming anyway. The second question was simpler. Does the math work? In 2017, the answer arrived. It did not. At the absolute peak of its power, the group could not generate enough profit to cover its own interest payments. It survived only as long as new loans kept arriving. And that summer, Beijing had seen enough. Regulators ordered the banks to scrutinize their exposure to the country's most aggressive overseas buyers, with HNA at the top of the list, and within weeks, the lending stopped. A company built on endless refinancing suddenly could not refinance. HNA started selling high-interest investment products to its own workforce through its own peer-to-peer lending platforms. Roughly 23,000 of its employees, plus tens of thousands of relatives and outside savers, handed their money to the company that paid their salaries, chasing returns no bank would offer. Keep that detail in mind. Those people come back at the end of this story. And then this story stops being about money. On July 3, 2018, HNA's co-chairman Wang stood in Banyu, a hilltop village in Provence. Wang held roughly 15% of HNA, the same as Chen, ran the day-to-day operations, and had personally set the goal of storming the Fortune Global 500. At the highest point of the village, he climbed onto a low stone wall, about waist height, to pose for a photograph. On the other side of that wall was a cliff. Witnesses told police he tried to get up once, failed, then took a run at it. He went over the top and fell roughly 15 meters onto the rocks below. Wang Jian, the operator, the man who actually ran the machine, was pronounced dead within hours. He was 57 years old. French police investigated, performed an autopsy, and ruled it an accident. The internet ruled otherwise, and when a French newspaper published a witness claiming Wang had jumped, the theories exploded all over again. The police never changed their conclusion. Hainan's websites turned gray in mourning, and the empire lost its chief engineer at the exact moment the engine was coming apart. What followed was one of the biggest fire sales in corporate history. Hilton sold at a profit of roughly $2 billion. Deutsche Bank sold down. The Park Avenue Tower, gone. The golf courses, gone. Hong Kong Express sold to Cathay Pacific for $628 million. By late 2018, Chen admitted the group had already offloaded $43 billion of assets. It was not enough. By the middle of that year, HNA's own books showed 657 billion yuan of debt, $98 billion. Then came the one blow. No airline empire can survive. The pandemic. In February 2020, with fleets grounded and the cash gone, the government of Hainan province walked in and took control. What its working group found was worse than anyone imagined. Of roughly 2,300 HNA companies, about 90% were empty shells. Fewer than 200 did any real business. Money had sloshed between affiliates in the trillions of yuan, and the group was insolvent by more than 600 billion yuan. HNA, it turned out, was mostly paper. On January 29th, 2021, creditors pushed HNA into bankruptcy. 321 companies were thrown into one collective case, and more than 60,000 creditors filed claims totaling 1.2 trillion yuan, roughly $187 billion. There is the number from the start of this story. It was the largest bankruptcy in Chinese history and the third largest corporate restructuring the world had ever seen. On September 24th, 2021, police took away Chen Feng and his chief executive. The founder was detained at a hotel in Sanya, a beach resort on the very island where he had built it all. Anbang's chairman had already received 18 years back in 2018. Everyone understood what came next. Here's the twist nobody saw coming. The buyer that rescued the airline was not another carrier, not a state champion, not a foreign giant. It was Liaoning Fangda, a steel and carbon conglomerate run by a man who started out trading scrap metal. Fangda injected roughly 40 billion yuan, around $6 billion, and took the keys in December 2021. By April 2022, one of the most complex corporate unwinds ever attempted was complete. A scrap steel dealer ended up owning the crown jewel of Chinese private aviation, and the employees who had lent the company their savings. Under the restructuring plan, a flight crew member could receive at most 190,000 yuan in cash, around $30,000, with the rest paid back in shares and trust paper. Thousands of people who trusted the company with everything got back a fraction in real money. Justice moved slowly, then all at once. In July 2025, a court in Haikou sentenced Chen Feng, now 72 years old, to 12 years in prison for embezzlement, breach of duty, and fraudulently obtaining loans. He was fined 221 million yuan, with 40 million more in personal assets confiscated. The chairman of the charity foundation that on paper owned HNA received 3.5 years of his own. If Chen serves the full sentence, he walks free in 2033, at 80 years old, into a world where his empire no longer exists. But here's the part that makes this an aviation story and not just a crime story. Through the debt, the death, the detentions, and the biggest bankruptcy in Chinese history, Hainan Airlines never stopped flying, not for one day. The crews kept their schedules while the empire above them burned. Why? Because the airline was one of the few parts of HNA that did something real, and real things survive paper fires. Under new owners, it is quietly doing what it always did best. In 2025, it operated around 220 aircraft, posted its first full-year profit since the collapse, and through the first 9 months of the year, out-earned every other listed airline in China, the state giants included. In late 2025, it became the first Chinese carrier to fly the brand new Airbus A330neo, and the 787 Dreamliners that once carried the empire's ambitions across the Pacific are earning again. Strip away the golf courses, the skyscrapers, the bank stakes, and the foundations, and it turns out the thing at the very bottom of the pile, the little island airline that started with 2 leased 737s, was the only part of HNA that was ever real. So here's my question for you. Chen Feng took a company that could not afford a wing and built it into a global giant, then destroyed it with the exact same playbook that created it. Was HNA brought down by one man's ambition, or by a system that handed unlimited credit to anyone bold enough to take it? And if the empire had never existed, could Hainan Airlines have become one of the truly great carriers of the world? Tell me what you think in the comments. If you enjoy the business side of aviation, the rises, the collapses, and the survivors, subscribe to ExPlaned, because there are plenty more airlines with secrets left to tell. Thank you for watching this video. Stay safe, healthy, and kind, and I will see you in the next one.